hello, and welcome to Kindred Skulls. Wordle. We got Wordle fans here on this show. My name is Greg Blake. I'm one of the co-hosts of this show. I thought I'd try that intro out on you guys, see how it went over.
We are officially in the off season, folks.
I'd call that a tepid response, but that's okay.
You know,
we all love Wordle, though, don't we? Such a good game. Those voices you hear are my co-hosts. Let's go one by one. Nick Olson, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, man. I do enjoy my fair share of Wordles, so I'm a fan. We're in the Wordle stage of the pandemic.
It's been fun to do. Have something to do every day. I'm not sure I'm addicted like some people we know who are going back and doing like every one that's ever been done. That's kind of crazy to me.
We do know some people like that. And that voice you hear right now is Matt Friese. Hi, Matt. How are you this evening?
Doing well.
Excellent. We are in off-season mode, and so I feel relaxed. I'm in a hoodie tonight. You know, I'm kicking back. This is a chill cast from me. Okay, we're just gonna have some fun.
We're full Mike McDaniel mode right now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just kicking back, man. I'm cutting it loose here. You guys want to just dive right in?
Let's do it.
Yeah,
all right. So this week we spent a lot of time interviewing candidates. The Vikings are at least starting that process and being pretty public about it. Everybody's making announcements like literally after a coach is done interviewing. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, I don't get that at all. I don't get that at all. Like, I get that. I guess you want to keep your people informed, but it's just like we don't need a graphic for like every single person that interviewed for a position. Like, it's not useful information. We already knew they were going to interview. Like, I don't get it.
It's one of those things where it's like because everything has become interesting to fans of sports, they feel the need to dress up even the most innocuous stuff. It's like we don't actually care. I just want to know who you're interviewing. That's all. And to that end, on the GM side, I'm just going to fire off some names. I mean, we can just give a quick, reaction to that, I guess. The names for the GM candidates that we've talked to so far: Nick's number one guy, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, Glenn Cook, who I don't even remember who that is.
He's the Browns as well.
Oh, okay, yeah. Elliot Wolf, which was my guy. John Spytek. Ryan Poles was an interesting name that came up this week. Catherine Raish, who a lot of people found really interesting. Monty Ossenfort, don't know who that is. And
great name, Titans.
He's a Titans guy, yeah. I think he's also in the Patriots mold, like because that front office, John Robinson was a Patriots guy, I think.
Can I just say about the Titans for a second? They are, I don't know if this is true for you guys, an enormous blind spot for me this season. Like I did not even know they were the number one seed before playoff weekend started. I know that's embarrassing to say, but I when playoff weekend started and I was like, the Titans are the number one seed. I didn't even know that.
The Titans are they had an absurd season. Like they beat every single good team, but like they don't feel like a good team themselves. So it's just very weird.
They're like the Bizarro Vikings in that they've got their own version of Kirk Cousins and their own version of Dalvin Cook with their wide zone play action running game and their own version of Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and their own version of an incredibly banged up roster. Only difference is they actually lived up to the hype.
Yeah, exactly.
Their own questions about their cornerbacks. They really are like a Bizarro Vikings, but they are the one seed and we are here sitting here 8-9 out of the playoffs.
Yeah, and Nick, you might be onto something there. That might be a subconscious effort on my brain's part to just spare me from having to go through it with two different teams. It's like the Titans are too. I recognize that. I can't watch more of that. Maybe that's what it is. Anyway, sorry. The Titans, Monty Ossenfort from the Titans, and then Brandon Brown. I also don't know who that is.
Eagles director, college scout.
Oh yeah, those lauded Eagles. We're going after those guys for some reason.
It's the analytic stuff. And he's like a hot riser too. I would say if it's not Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, Brandon Brown would be who I would expect to win the job actually.
Okay, all right. Well, they did draft Kenneth Gainwell, whoever they like. All right, let's All right, so that's the GM candidates. We don't have a ton to say about it right now, right? We know the team's probably going to interview more people. Some of those names, were names we wanted to see, so that's great.
Yeah.
Anything you guys want to add to that?
Just to wrap up, the guy I mentioned last week, Will McClay, it sounds like he got a lot more money from the Cowboys or something. There was a notification that he's going to stay put. And he's in a little bit different position there with the Cowboys, where he probably is the de facto GM, even if that's not his title, because Jerry Jones likes to have the power. So
he is a power consolidator. You don't become a billionaire without being in.
Or Stephen Jones, I guess, which they're not firing Mike McCarthy, which is really interesting, but we can get to that with coaches.
Yeah. All right. So to that end, let's move on to coaches. Here's the list of candidates so far. We've got Kellen Moore, which was a big one for me. Although I think a little bit of the shine is off the what is the phrase? Shine off the rose or whatever. After that game, it's pretty brutal.
Yeah,
pretty brutal. Nationally televised beatdown doesn't do a lot for you as a candidate. We got Jonathan Gannon. Don't know who that is.
He is the Eagles defensive coordinator and a hot name in this coaching cycle
Eagles
for no reason.
My God.
I don't get that.
Defense isn't even good.
No,
they're not. No, they're totally unremarkable. I actually went and looked. I didn't remember his name, but I looked up how the Eagles did this year, because I was like, why is he even on the list? And I was like, they're middle of the road in every conceivable category. Yeah. They're totally unremarkable.
Yeah, it's wild. But
very strange to see him on the list. It must be some connection to the organization or something. Then you've got Nathaniel Hackett. You've got Dan Quinn, which is one of the big names that's kind of risen very quickly over the last couple of weeks. Kevin O'Connell. I don't know Kevin O'Connell.
He's Rams offensive coordinator.
Oh, right. Okay.
He touched Sean McVay. He must be okay as that.
Yeah, that stuff scares me, man.
Which those guys freaking have worked out so far. So I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. Smart group of people over there. And then you've got D'Amico Ryans, another fast rising name, a defensive coordinator candidate, but, someone very recognizable, running a really interesting defense over there.
Defense is actually good and creative. So
good and creative. And
I'm okay with that one.
And I was always pretty scared of D'Amico Ryans back in the day when we played against him. He was a monster. Then you got Todd Bowles, which is just an enormous red flag to me that he's even on our list. But then you got...
I like Bowles.
I like Bowles, the guy. I don't love what happened there with him.
It's also the Jets. So you do have to give him a little bit of a pass with that.
That's true. I just feel like those teams never had anything interesting going on either side of the ball. They did draft some interesting players, though, with him around. Anyway, Raheem Morris kind of rounding out the list, at least for this week. Another big name. I'm a little underwhelmed by this head coach list. This is not. Yeah.
So I agree. I think the no McDaniels thing, which I know, Nick, you were big on McDaniels, is made because McDaniels hasn't gotten any steam this coaching cycle. I don't think is probably a signal that Josh McDaniels is the successor to Bill Belichick in New England, and he's just going to stay there until Bill Belichick retires, hangs him up. Right. So I think that might be part of it. But the other part is we're all kind of looking for offensive minds, right? And with Kellen Moore, which I don't think the Cowboys game should be a referendum on Kellen Moore necessarily, who he is as an offensive mind, but he wasn't the superstar, rising superstar. I mean, he kind of was, but he wasn't clear cut that anyway, going into it, I think. So the lack of an offensive mind, which I think is what most people want after Zimmer, is kind of the big thing. But I do like the player coaches. I do very much like the idea of Raheem Morris and D'Amico Ryans right now. I think that those guys are more, the leader oriented, the Mike, and we talked about the Titans earlier, right? How they've done so well with Mike Vrabel. And that's not always a type of coach that works, right? That's something that you probably need to hit the right lane. But based on what's come out of the organization, it seems like they're probably going to lean that way with how much they talked about communication. Every single person mentioned it when they were talking about what they want to look for in the next head coach, right? So if you have those good player communicators, and it doesn't need to be a Leslie Frazier who ended up being a little bit of a pushover, right, as a coach. but it can be a guy who holds people accountable, but is still good as a communicator and a leader. And it really seems like Raheem Morris and D'Amico Ryans could be that. So I am most intrigued by them, and they're probably my favorite candidates right now.
Interesting. Nick, did you have any reactions to this list that you want to share with us generally?
The thing that sticks out to me is it's a lot of defensive guys, which surprised me because I feel like a lot of people wanted to move on from Zimmer specifically because of the offensive coordinator tumult we've had, just zero consistency there. I think Pat Shurmur was the longest tenure guy, and only because he was a holdover from when Norv got resigned / fired or pushed out. So that's a little surprising. And then the fact that I don't know. I feel like two of the offensive guys are Rams 49ers guys. So that makes sense. I feel like it would make sense if you're going to bring in an offensive guy to do somebody who can hit the ground running with a team set up kind of to do wide zone. Not that we have to continue to be a wide zone team, but I think it makes sense to try and look at, especially at those guys that, because it's kind of where this team is set up to succeed right now. And it's kind of also where the NFL is continuing to become more and more of a wide zone team. So, or a wide zone league. So it makes sense to look at those offensive coordinators. But, I'm kind of with you, Greg. None of these guys, it would be hard to get excited about any of these guys, to be honest.
Yeah,
so
I'm not jumping off my seat. I think, Matt, I think you made a really good case for those guys. And like I said, I'll try to keep an open mind if any of these guys are the ones we go with. But I think the biggest thing for me is, we came so close with Mike Zimmer. I think that went about as well as you could hope with a defensive coordinator as a coach. Like I think, we were in the mix. We went to a championship game. We were in the mix, and so I think like one of the biggest problems that we had as a team, and we've talked about this as a group before, is having to change our offensive philosophies so often and having a lot of inconsistency on that side of the ball. It just really, really limited us in certain years, at least. I just feel like we need to go a different direction as a team, try something different. And I don't know if a player coach or a defensive coordinator coach, where we have coordinators who are constantly being snapped up after every season, is the right direction. That's my biggest concern is, I think it's easier to replace a defensive coordinator or find a defensive coordinator who sticks around than it is to find an offensive coordinator who's going to stick around.
Yeah. No, you are right that you really need to get your staff right for that to be able to work.
Yeah. Like if you have some OC, like the example I've used, when we chatted in the past is Morris, I think was his name, from the Indianapolis Colts. White-haired guy.
Tom Moore.
Tom Moore. Thank you. Yeah, Tom Moore. He was the Colts offensive coordinator. I think Peyton's
he was like quarterbacks coach, but he was like a lifelong lifer quarterbacks.
He was with Peyton like his entire career.
Yeah. And
I think that's about the best you could possibly imagine. And I think that's probably one of the only times it's happened. So I don't know. That's my biggest concern about that list. But we spent too much time on this as it is. Did you guys have any final thoughts about this? Okay.
Mike McDaniel, please.
Please, come on. Let's get some exciting people in here. All right. Let's just touch briefly though on we won't spend a ton of time on this, but just given the options that we've looked at so far at GM and DC, you see a lot of big names popping up. So it seems pretty clear to me that we're going to have more interesting interviews because it seems like we're kind of attractive location. And that's kind of something people have been buzzing about online this week. So when you look at like the GM locations, you got the Raiders, Bears, the Giants, and us basically. And of those four teams, like who do you want to take over right now as a possible GM?
Those four, I'm going with the Vikings. I think none of these are particularly attractive, and you can make an argument for the Raiders as GM, but I think the Vikings, they just gave Rick Spielman 15 years or something with the org, or maybe 10 as GM. So you're getting a very long leash there. Yeah. The ownership is good. The facilities are good. The history is great. We've got a good roster. If you want to come in and compete now, you can. If you want to go more of a rebuild direction, like where the Lions are right now, you'll have that latitude there, and whichever route you want to go with it. The Wilfs I think have proven that they're going to give you the resources financially to succeed, and the sort of the freedom to go about and do that however you want to. So, I mean, the Giants, obviously a great organization, lots of history there, but it's kind of that roster is kind of a mess right now. Bears, Justin Fields is a draw, but when you're the GM and you're looking at a bad cap situation, no first round pick heading into next year, and a bad an aging roster with all of its like star players, Mack, Hicks, a lot of these guys, really past their prime, it's kind of tough. Raiders are kind of trickier because, I mean, the Raiders, I think, do have an up-and-coming roster. Obviously, they're a playoff team this year, better than you can say for the Vikings. You've got a similar quarterback that you can win with or you can move on from. So there's some appeal there. It's a tougher division. I don't know how you feel about Las Vegas. That's kind of tricky. I'm not sure you would want to go there as opposed to a more stable org like Minnesota, and the ownership I don't think is quite in the Wilfs tier. So, but that one I could see an argument, but I think Bears and Giants are clearly a tier below, despite being very storied franchises.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think that even though the Bears and Giants are very storied franchises, like recently they've had high profile screw ups, right? Basically in terms of managing their team from the ownership level. And I think when you get like a generational divide like that, where these aren't the owners that made them successful, right? These are the kids of the owners that made them successful.
Right.
And maybe they think they know what they're doing, but maybe they don't actually know what they're doing. And that also kind of applies to Mark Davis a little bit, right? But I think the Raiders, just from a roster construction standpoint, are in a lot better place right now. So I would put the Raiders and the Vikings kind of on a similar level, and then the Bears and the Giants below that. But I will say the Bears, depending on the person, you could skyrocket because of Justin Fields, right? It kind of depends on how the person views him.
I think that's a really good point. I also think it's worth mentioning that the Raiders may not even be an option for a lot of these GM candidates, because if they go with the Harbaugh, that's a role he wants to take on.
He'd probably have personnel powers. So
as far as the GM thing goes, the Bears and Giants might really be our only competitors for these guys. So I would be surprised if we didn't really take our time with this list. Bring in as many people as possible. I'm hoping that is what we do. But
they're clearly casting a wide net with their GM search.
Yeah.
I mean, they're interviewing. I mean, a lot of the GMs they're looking at are scout type guys, directors of college scouting, like directors of player personnel. But they've also, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is an analytics guy. They've got Brandon Brown, who's, he's analytics, but he's also director of personnel. They've got Catherine Raish or whoever. So kind of, they're looking. I don't think they're leaving any stone unturned here. So they do have the luxury of time here, which is probably a little frustrating, because you kind of expect the NFL coaching and GM carousel to move a little faster than it has this year. But Vikings, I think, are taking advantage of the fact that they can take their time and they can do a deep dive, and they don't have to rush into a shotgun merit with anybody just because of competition. So
Nor should they.
Yeah, and I totally agreed. Yeah. Totally agreed.
It's such an important moment in this team's history. Like this is such a, if we make the wrong choice here, it could send us careening down a 4 or 5 year path that none of us want to go down. If we make the right choice, we might be right back in the mix within a year or two. So
why do you want to sprint to hire Urban Meyer because he's the hot name? Right. Like, making rash decisions like that is just a bad idea.
Yeah, totally agreed. No matter how much I like certain candidates or whatever, I hope the team takes its time. And I think the same could be said of the coaching situation. The competitors we have for coaching candidates are a little more varied, but they're not great options. You got the Broncos, the Jaguars, the Raiders again, Texans, Bears, Giants, Dolphins. We don't know what's going on there. I mean, and Dolphins and Broncos maybe would. Anyway, that's the list, and then us, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, Dolphins and Broncos, I think you can make the strongest case for. But
I would say it's the Vikings, Broncos, Raiders. as the top three for me. And that's because of the roster situation. The Raiders have a better cap situation. They have a very similar quarterback to Kirk but a lot cheaper as well in Derek Carr. So I think that's a big up for the Raiders against us. Now the GM/ownership, question, maybe not as stable there. So that's kind of your downside. And you will have to pay Carr as well. Dolphins, I don't want to touch with how they've handled the Brian Flores situation. And there may be some other things going on there, but that ownership does not seem to have things right. I mean, recently,
I was trying to throw them a bone. I wouldn't want to go there if I was a head coach. But
they were a good team, but they kind of imploded with the Flores. And it sounds like from the stories coming out, maybe they had their reasons there, but it's just it's tough. I don't know. There's clearly there's a whole tier of teams here that are always looking for a new head coaches, and I think that just goes back to bad ownership and how much that can just make things an uphill climb for franchises to get out of the basement. So
totally agree.
Yeah, like Texas, they fired David Culley for what? Winning 4 games? Like who are you going to attract to that Houston job? It's just tough. I mean, look at that roster. It's really tough to get on board with that thing compared to, if you could coach the Broncos. I mean, look how talented that team is. So I think there are clearly a couple different tiers. I'd probably have the Broncos first, just because I think that roster is we say this a lot and usually joke about it, but they really are like, if they get a quarterback in this offseason, they ride the carousel and will walk away with Rodgers or Russell Wilson or even Kirk Cousins. I think that's a really interesting team because they're so good on the defensive side of the ball. And they got a lot of great young pieces on the offense as well, both skilled players and offensive linemen. So Broncos, I think, are really attractive. I mean, the downside is quarterback. You don't have an option right now, and it's a really, really tough division. So that makes things a little tricky.
I do think though, one thing that we can't understate is if you still believe, like I do, that Trevor Lawrence can be, one of the next great quarterbacks.
Like with the Bears, I think the Jags and the Bears are in that category of the team is not great and you have a lot of concerns. But if you're a guy who wants the quarterback, that goes to the top of the list for you.
Right. Like,
but
you say, you know what? I've got Trevor Lawrence. I'll deal with everything else. I can see that.
But the Jags organizationally are way worse off than the Bears. Like, if I'm a coaching candidate, I don't want to deal with the Jags organization. I don't want to deal with the Texans organization. They're dumpster fires.
Yeah.
So that's the question, right?
It's got to be such a bummer for Jags fans. I mean, you were so excited that this guy was coming in, big, big money pockets for you, and it just hasn't worked out.
And you're wearing clown suits to the last game of the season. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's a big bummer. Any final thoughts? I cut you off a little bit, Nick. I'm sorry. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share on the who the best?
It's kind of interesting that, I mean, the unifying thing about teams that fired their head coach, they tend not to be very good. So it's not the toughest competition. Vikings went 8-9, narrowly missed the playoffs despite lots of banged up guys. So I do think it's a really attractive job. But obviously, first the Vikings are going to have to hire the GM. Some of these other teams, like the Broncos, already have their GM situation very much figured out. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. We'll make the next few weeks interesting, along with all the playoffs.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, Matt, are you ready?
Oh, I'm so ready for this.
Okay, cool. So this is it, folks. We're doing our end of season awards. We did a sort of a mid-season awards during our bye week. We picked best players, most overrated players, and so forth. So we're going to do that again. Now that we have the full season scope and view, we can finalize our list. And I thought this is how we could go through this so that we can get through everything tonight. Pardon me. So I thought we could go. I'll say what the award is or what the position or whatever. And then each of us can just say the individual. And then if there's something to talk about, we'll talk about it. If it's like totally obvious, there's nothing to talk about, we'll just move on. And Matt, you can tell us who our mid-season pick was. And we can just go that in cycle. Okay. You guys, does that sound good to you?
Yeah, ready to go.
All right, awesome. Let's do this thing. All right, so our first end of season award is I got to get that award music back. I think I had like a sting.
You did.
Yeah,
you did.
I got to get that back. Let's start this over. Cut that, Greg. Cut that. All right, that's me talking to myself as the editor.
Really?
I'm not actually going to
Shocking.
do it either. That's all staying in. This whole thing is staying in. Okay, you guys ready? It's time for the Kindred Skulls end of season awards. Music, guys. This music. Smiling cameras. Okay. All right. Let's start with the best offensive player. And let's begin the cycle with Nick. Who is your best offensive player this season?
It's interesting because I don't think this was necessarily the best season he's had in his NFL career, but it's Justin Jefferson. He had over 1,600 yards, and that's like the top 10 in the last 10 years. It's just insanely good. Overshadowed by Cooper Kupp, like almost breaking the all-time record, but like 1,600 yards, that's insane. Just a very complete player. Elite route runner, very good hands, although it was a little shakier this year than we saw last year. Just so good after the catch, kind of just has a very natural feel, great like flexibility in his ability to bend his body, not lose speed out of his cuts, valuable in the blocking game, run game. Just you can line him up anywhere, slot, out wide, in the backfield, tight to the inline. So just a very complete player. I'm tempted to give Kirk Cousins a shout out because as miserably as some of those last games were, we didn't really see bad Kirk. We saw like mediocre Kirk, and the highs were still there this year. So I think Cousins had a very, very good game. But I think it's kind of Justin Jefferson in a runaway.
Just a friendly reminder, say their name and let's go in a circle and then we can talk about it.
So,
sorry. Okay.
No,
it's okay.
No, you're good.
You should have played my
Jefferson-
Oscars music to
the only
tune
reason-
me out.
The only reason is because we're probably all going to say Justin Jefferson, and I'd like Matt to also be able to get a chance to say
Justin
his piece
Jefferson.
around it.
I have nothing to add other than emphasizing it's his second season. It's probably not his best season in the NFL. And he was obviously the best player on the team. How ridiculous is that? Like, he's so good, and he was so good as a rookie. It's crazy.
I was thinking about what I could possibly say about him. I mean, we talked about him in the preseason when he went down. We were like, I don't know what our season looks like without this guy. We talked about him every week of the year. We talked about him. The only time we talked about him negatively was one game where he had like 70 yards instead of 100 gazillion yards. We're talking about him now, and that's because he has completely taken over that offense. He is our best player. We go where Justin Jefferson goes, and let's hope that relationship stays good because he's a revelation. And there's not
one vote short of being a first-team All-Pro. Debo beat him out, which I can't blame people for putting Debo in over him, really. Like, I think all four of the top four were deserving. It just ended up he ended up being the odd man out. So at halfway through the season, at the bye week, all of us collectively agreed on our best offensive player of Kirk Cousins.
Oh God! That is not a good start. Well, no, okay. I was also thinking about that. And
he was really good for the first half of the year.
That's what I was going to say.
He kind of cooled off a little bit, but he's, like Nick said, he still had a very good season.
And I sort of begrudgingly brought myself to the table on that one. I don't regret it because I think at that point in the season, it was a reasonable position to take. But I think by the end of the year, it was JJ all the way. So, and I won't really think about any other player from this season other than him. So, any other things you'd like to add about JJ?
Let's keep it rolling.
We said it all. Let's keep it rolling here. All right. Best defensive player. Nick, who's your best defensive player?
Michael Pierce.
Michael Pierce. Interesting.
Harrison Smith for me.
Harrison Smith. Interesting. We have a. I'm going to go with Eric Kendricks again. This is interesting. So we all have a different choice. So why? Just briefly, why Michael Pierce for you, Nick?
I think he was the most consistently impressive player when I watched his film, and he, more than anyone, arguably Patrick Peterson's the other one who I would probably have as an honorable mention, got asked to do the most and still wound up being very impressive when asked to take on double teams, when asked to Andre Patterson wouldn't call it two gapping, but when he's asked to basically line up in a zero tech and just take on the center and kind of be able to make a play on both sides of the player. When asked to do any of those like really difficult things, he was just a complete difference maker. in the run game and allowed us to do a lot more too high looks than we're used to seeing from Zimmer, who for a long time lived out of, let Harrison Smith roam the box and put somebody up high. So that was really impressive. And then all the hype we saw of him as the pass rusher really came on. His ability, multiple sacks this year, lots of pressure, is not just a bull rush guy, but a really quick dude for somebody who's 350 pounds. So just snap to snap, I thought he played like an elite nose guard. And as far as everyone else, I think everyone else I kind of would nitpick some of their game this year. Like Harrison Smith, great player, great instinct still, but you're starting to, I think, to see he's not he was never like an elite athlete, but now I'd say he's more of an average NFL athlete. And with Kendricks, run defense was a little bit of a tricky thing this year. Patrick Peterson didn't have a great last game of the season. And his run defense was not as great as his coverage was this year. So I don't know. I can nitpick all the other players. I don't really have any nitpicks out of Michael Pierce other than I wish he had been healthier. So Michael Pierce is my answer.
Yeah. And on that, I think maybe, for me, not saying Michael Pierce, I think the injury in the 8 games or whatever it was that he was able to play is probably what prevents me from putting on the list, right? If you have that performance from Michael Pierce from a full 17 game season, I think he's pretty clearly the answer. But, it does hurt that, to me, that he wasn't on the field. And that's why I ended up going with Smith. I think there's a number of guys that you could go with, right? Obviously, we went over it, but at halfway through the year, I had Danielle Hunter here, right? Obviously, he was on track to do it as well before he gets injured. Really, Harrison Smith, I think all around just played at a very high level. You got the solid consistency. Maybe he doesn't make the elite splash plays that he used to, and I think that's one of the things that his athleticism slowing down has hurt him a little bit, but he's still so good at disguising. And if you remember that Steelers game, he did so much, especially in that game where he just had, the Steelers were entirely out of sorts on offense for the entire first half. It was a total nightmare. And that a large part of that reason is Harrison Smith. And that's why I put him as the best player. Kendricks, I would agree with you, Nick, where I think, and he did show up on the injury report quite a bit towards the end of the year. And I think his injury might've been hampering him a little bit. But still, like, the performance on the field and run defense, and even a couple times in pass coverage, wasn't quite up to his standard, which is, again, a really high standard. So it's kind of,
it is a very high standard. And my case for Kendricks has more to do with what I think the role I think he plays for this team. I think he's one of the emotional cores of the defense, and I think that matters. He's the guy who's, pulling Breland off of somebody when he's about to fight him, telling him get his head on straight. He's the guy, who's doing all that, but he also had the most combined tackles he's ever had in a season this year. He had the most solo tackles he's ever had in a season this year. He had a couple of picks. He made some game-changing plays. I'm giving him the nod, but I think it's interesting that we all kind of pick someone different, because I think that speaks to the kind of year we had. It was a very kind of befuddling year. It's hard to pick one star on the defense.
I think Kendricks probably had the most impressive highlights of any player this year. I just didn't see this down-to-down snap consistency that you saw from Danielle Hunter, Michael Pierce, even Harrison Smith. So
Sure.
And housekeeping, I mentioned I had Hunter at the halfway point, and you guys both had Kendricks. So
interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm the only consistent one. All right, let's move on. We have let's try to get through these next couple a little bit quicker. We've got most improved player. So the guy that made the biggest leap. I know my answer to this already. Nick, who's your most improved player this season?
KJ Osborne.
Yeah, Matt.
Runaway KJ Osborne.
Yeah, same here. I don't think there's really anything to talk about. We picked him in the mid-season. I don't even have to check that list to know that.
Yeah. So we picked him. I gave a little bit of a nod to Tyler Conklin, but it's still, like, obviously KJ Osborne. We've talked about him all season about how good he's been. He's the answer.
Yep, he's the answer.
James Lynch is my honorable mention, but Osborne went from off the roster to wide receiver 3, borderline potential wide receiver 2. So.
Yep. Very, very great season for him. All right. Best position group. Now, this might be a challenge. Kind of hard to pick a position group you really, really love this year. But Nick, who's your best position group this year?
For the 2021 Vikings defensive tackles.
So you're going to isolate with, okay, interesting. Matt, what's your best position group?
Defensive tackles as well.
Okay, I think that's kind of a cheat, you guys, but I'm going to agree with you and cheat as well. I'm going to say the defensive tackles. They were definitely our most talented group of players, and I think they were our most consistent group of players all season. I have to agree with you there. We never complained about the defensive tackles, not one single time all season long. That's actually pretty amazing, and the first time I really thought about it.
I mean, in reality, we're talking 4 deep or 5 deep, I guess, in this situation, right? If you count Sheldon Richardson, maybe because we're saying specifically defensive tackles,
we're cheating
him because of the defensive end play, right? But like, I think Nick mentioned James Lynch as honorable mention for most improved. Like that speaks to the progression of Armin Watts and James Lynch on that defensive line, how they were able to fill in and back up so effectively. Now, they're not perfect players. Maybe they're not guys that I want starting or playing the majority of the snaps, right? I'd rather have Peterson Tomlinson in there. But like just the quality from that group was great. And none of the other groups approached it.
Who was our midseason choice here, Matt?
So I had wide receivers, which I think would have been true had Adam Thielen not gotten injured / whatever as well, or would have at least been in the conversation. Nick had defensive tackles, so he remained consistent. And you had running backs, Greg, which, I mean, that was when Alex Madison had a couple of really productive games, and CJ Ham was really positive too. So, you know,
they fell off a little bit. All right. Let's move this thing right along. We've got our most overrated, and let's not spend too much time on this because we don't want to be too negative. There's a lot of players we could probably pick for this. Who's our most overrated player, Nick Olson?
That's tough. I know last time I mentioned Brian O'Neill, so that's probably Brian. I'll probably stick with Brian O'Neill.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with the guy who got like 2 All-Pro votes, which is Brian O'Neill, which is wild. I mean, like he's
a good player. He's just not a great
very good player. He's not an All-Pro caliber right tackle. There's too many deficiencies, specifically against power, you know, just in his game to put him at that level. Unfortunately, but he's still good. Like he's worth the money we paid him. Let's be clear about that. He's a long-term piece on this offensive line. It's just like, I think we overrate him because he is like the only good thing we've had in our offensive line for the past however many years.
That's interesting that you both picked him. I'm gonna look. My muzzle is off. Okay, it's done. My muzzle is off. I'm not pulling my punches anymore. For me, it's got to be Kirk Cousins. Primarily because, he another year he just, for whatever reason, with him at quarterback, we can't get over the hump. He's making a lot of money to get us there, and it didn't happen. And for me, that's got to be the guy.
Who is out there overrating Kirk Cousins, Greg? Like,
I think
when you log on Twitter or you go to NFL.com or ESPN,
I still think
there are a lot of Vikings people on Twitter.
MVP candidate Kirk Cousins.
I think there are a lot of people
who need to pay him more money. That Kirk Cousins, he's so underpaid.
It's so funny. I mean, genuinely funny how the tone has shifted around here. I used to be such the wallflower. I had to be very careful with how I approach every Kirk Cousins conversation. But I think there are still a lot of people who genuinely think, that we're the ones holding him back. And, I'm just not buying that shit anymore.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on. Who is the most underrated player on this team? Oh, who was our pick?
So I had Alex Madison at the half mark. Nick, as you mentioned, had Brian O'Neill, and you, Greg, had Harrison Smith.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yep.
Still, that was a good take.
Which I don't think it's a bad take. Like I think it was definitely noteworthy, although I wouldn't have put him as overrated necessarily.
I think that might have been a bit harsh. I was trying to be contrarian.
Yep.
Anyway, let's move on. Who is the most underrated player on this team? Nick Olson.
I would say Anthony Barr this year.
Okay, he'll hold that thought. Matt, who's your most underrated player?
It's kind of like best defensive player, where it's hard to like gauge which one of the defensive players it is. I'm gonna go with Dalvin Tomlinson.
Hold that thought. I wasn't sure at all who I was going to say, but as soon as you said Anthony Barr, Nick, I was just overwhelmed with positive feelings. You know, I think we watched our last games with Anthony Barr this year, and I think he gave us a great send-off, and it's a real damn shame we don't get to watch him play anymore. So I'm going to go with Anthony Barr as well.
The Nick saying Anthony Barr is what made me hesitate in my response there, because I was like, oh man, should I go with Anthony Barr? But no, I think you can make valid arguments for Barr, Dalvin Tomlinson, and Patrick Peterson, who we've kind of talked up. So we definitely don't underrate Patrick Peterson here on this podcast. Yeah. But I think generally, like, Dalvin, you know, he didn't have the flashes that Michael Pierce did, right? And Michael Pierce was more dominant when he was in there, but just the consistent, like the difference in run defense from this past season, or the difference in the defensive tackle play from this past season to 2020 is just like absolutely astonishing, right? The regularly controlling blockers and allowing the linebackers to run free. Just really the dirty work in there. You know, he's not the best pass rusher, but it worked.
I agree. So we have a little bit of a time constraint this evening, and I want to make sure we get to a little bit of playoff talk. So here's how I'd like to propose we handle these last two. Sure. Well, before I say this, who was our most underrated player at the midpoint?
Oh, so I had Dalvin Tomlinson, kept it consistent. Nick had Patrick Peterson, and you had Patrick Peterson as well. Okay. So the Peterson people flipped to Anthony Barr, which is totally reasonable.
That's Patrick Peterson's my second. Dalvin Thompson's a really good choice too.
Why don't we just jump to the playoff talk then, Greg?
Well, actually, no. I'd like to do this last section, but here's how I'd like to do it, just to save time for dramatic, moments. Let's each just say the name of the next two categories. Okay, no commentary. We'll let the listeners do with this what they will. All right. We're trying a little experiment here. Please retain this player. This is our call out to our next GM. If you happen to come across this podcast for some reason, these are the guys we want you to retain. Please retain this player. Nick Olson, who do you want the Minnesota Vikings to retain, no matter how the chips shake out?
Patrick Peterson.
Matt.
If Daniil Hunter wasn't cheating, it would be him, but Patrick Peterson.
Wow. I mean, I'm going to say Patrick Peterson as well, because I think we could use a veteran. Sorry, I broke my own rule already. All right.
My 1B is Barr, but I think the writing's on the wall that relationship's over. So
yeah, I agree.
I just do not want to watch our backup linebackers forward. I don't want to see Troy Dyer run fits again, but it seems like that's what we're doomed to see. So
yikes. Please move on from this player. Who is the player that you most wish the Minnesota Vikings to move on from this offseason, Nick?
It's got to be Kirk, right?
Matt?
Kirk.
Come on, it's Kirk Cousins.
That's the reason I put the category in. So
I even like Kirk Cousins. I'm just sick of talking about him. I want to talk about Malik Willis. I want to talk about somebody else.
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah, nothing else to say here. Okay, so the playoffs are happening. They're happening around us. I've been engaging with them. I'm sure you guys have been too. They've been a little boring so far. Couple of good games. The matchups weren't great in the first round, but anyway, they're happening. Of the teams that are left right now, there's some really, really great teams, great organizations, great rosters, great players, young quarterback. I mean, there's some really exciting, kind of the future of the league. It feels like a very shifting moment in time, kind of the last couple of off seasons have. This one in particular, although Justin Herbert is missing, which is unfortunate. What franchise that's left in the playoffs do you most wish that the Minnesota Vikings kind of aspire to be? And it doesn't mean necessarily we try to clone their roster or whatever, but just the direction you'd like us to go philosophically, roster construction, what direction would you love to see this team head towards, or model, or whatever, however you want to put it. Let's switch it up a little bit. Matt, which team would you pick, and just briefly why?
So I'm going to go with the Bills. I think a lot of the teams in the playoffs, you can say they have the superstar quarterback. And it's hard to say you want to model yourself after them because you have like this guy who is the guy. But I think the Bills, with their willingness to go after Josh Allen, with their willingness to put the supporting cast around them, is how you build the superstar quarterback, right? Because Josh Allen was terrible at Wyoming, frankly. And he improved significantly. And part of that's on the player, but I think part of it's on the team. Brandon Beane, as their GM, came from a non-traditional background. He doesn't have a football background. He started in the football operations side. He worked his way up through that side. So it is kind of interesting, having a not necessarily a scout guy come in there. I kind of like that idea. And we've interviewed a number of those people. Sean McDermott is more of the culture head coach, right? Leslie Frazier is calling the defense. Brian Dable is calling the offense. He's more of the culture player leader kind of head coach. So I kind of like that model, and I like that willingness to build around that player. Even the way they've handled the offense, the way they've handled building it, signing offensive linemen in free agency and targeting players there rather than necessarily drafting them. I think that's a big inefficiency that you can hit. Sure. And then just the willingness to be aggressive, go out and get digs, just a bunch of stuff they've done really, really well up there.
A great choice. It seems like a pretty obvious choice of this group. Nick, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I mean, I totally agree with you. Nick, who would you pick? And it's okay if your answer is the same.
Yeah, I would say overall the Bills have done the most impressive job with the way they've built out that roster, and not just where they are now, but how they got there. I think the process has been really impressive. If I can Frankenstein monster it, I would say I love the way the Bills, the Chiefs, or the Packers approach their quarterback position, where they draft toolsy guys. Packers wait later in the first round, drafted a high upside guys. For the Chiefs and Bills, they traded up to get a guy, in the 10 to 15 range. But I love that. And I love the results, the dividends it's paid for them. For the coaching, I love the 49ers. I would love to have the next Kyle Shanahan. I just love everything he does. He's so good at designing plays, but also sequencing them really smart. So I love what they do. And then in terms of if I could steal any teams, the way they draft, it'd be the Buccaneers. They've just done, they've been on such a run of drafting incredible dudes year after year after year. And it shows in how talented that roster is. Even beyond Tom Brady. But yeah, if I'm going for just one, I would say the Bills. And if I have to answer another team, I would say reluctantly it's the Packers. They're just a model franchise in terms of the talent they find in the draft, the way they retain them, the way they're able to always sort of flush out some of the older guys, let them go and find new young guys, the Rashawn Gary breakouts, be able to weather the storms of even star players, Bakhtiari, Jair Alexander, missing time, Zadarius Smith. So, and just the quarterback, Devontae Adams, all the talent they built on the roster. So I think the Packers have done and Matt LaFleur as well, have done a really, really impressive job with that team too. So
yeah, I would agree with that. I think those are all great points. I think the Bills are a great of the moment team to want to model your organization after. But I'm gonna say, for me, I'm gonna go with the horse that brung you. I'm gonna say the Kansas City Chiefs, just because I think this has been a year where everyone has kind of conveniently forgotten about them in a way. And I think that happened to the Patriots a lot in their run. And I'm very interested to watch how the Chiefs kind of approach these playoffs. And if they manage to get back to the big game, how everything might snap into focus for people, remind you just what this team has done. And so the fact that we're interviewing people from the Chiefs makes me very encouraged. I think that's an organization I would love to model ourselves after, because they do a lot of the things that you guys want, and I want too. The aggressive trade moves, going for toolsy quarterbacks, all the different things. So I think they're kind of my guys. But I love the Bills too. And everything Nick said too, I do agree with you.
One last thing for me to add there is with the Chiefs. I think it's funny because when I was going back and listening to that previous episode, that was when everybody was freaking out about how Patrick Mahomes was bad now and the Chiefs were bad. It was so ridiculous.
It was so dumb.
It was so dumb at the time, but it was just so funny. The one thing with the Chiefs, and Nick mentioned the 49ers, is there's not an Andy Reid or a Kyle Shanahan in the market. So that's what kind of puts them a little bit away from me, is I can't guarantee that I'm going to get those guys. So that kind of scares me off with them.
That's a very fair point. And one of many you've both made this evening. you guys have any final thoughts you'd like to share? We've got to wrap things up here.
Hire Quessy.
Hire Quessy. Hire Mike McDaniel. Yeah.
Hire smart people. That's all I want. All right, guys. It was lovely to join you this evening. And to all of our listeners, have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the games. And we'll talk to you next week. Digital hugs.
Another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score.